The wind howled across the barren plains, carrying with it the scent of sagebrush and distant smoke. Out in the vast openness of the west, where the horizon seemed endless and the sun painted the sky in streaks of gold and crimson, life was hard and unforgiving. For those who called this rugged land home, survival was a daily battle against nature, against the loneliness, and sometimes against the cruelty of other men. Among them lived a woman whose name few remembered, yet whose story would soon become one that no one could forget. She was a widow, her husband taken too soon by a fever that left her alone with only her memories and the small, weathered cabin he had built with his own hands. Life had a way of testing her, yet she met each day with quiet strength, tending her land, keeping her hearth warm, and never asking for more than what she could handle. It was one of those early mornings when the sun barely touched the horizon, and the world was draped in a soft, silvery mist, that she heard the cries. At first, she thought it was the wind, tossing the tumbleweeds across the prairie, but the sound was too sharp, too desperate. She stepped outside, the frost crunching beneath her boots, and followed the cries to a small ravine not far from her cabin. There, lying among the rocks and brush, were two tiny figures, their skin the color of the earth and their eyes wide with fear and confusion. The children were naked and shivering, abandoned or left behind in the chaos of a raid. She would never know. The woman's heart ached, yet she didn't hesitate. Wrapping them in blankets she had always kept for emergencies, she carried them back to her cabin, murmuring soothing words she barely understood herself. The children were Apache, she realized, from the patterns etched faintly on their small faces and the way their eyes held a strength beyond their years. Raising them would not be easy. The neighbors whispered, questioning why a white widow would take in the children of a tribe that many considered enemies. But she ignored them, for in their cries she heard something familiar, cry for home, for safety, for love. And she had the space, the means, and the will to give it. That winter the cabin became a world unto itself. Fires burned longer, meals were shared, and slowly the children began to trust the woman who had taken them in without question. They never spoke much at first, communicating in gestures, in the language of survival, and gradually the woman learned enough to teach them some of her own words, the words of kindness, of warmth, of home. Time moved slowly, yet it moved as it always does. The children grew stronger, taller, and the shadows of their past began to fade in the warmth of the woman's care. She farmed, hunted, and shared stories of her husband, planting seeds not just in the soil, but in the hearts of the children who had no one else. She taught them to respect the land, to listen to the wind, to honor life even when it was cruel. There were moments of laughter, moments when the world seemed softer, and moments of quiet grief when she thought of her husband and the life they could have had. The children, in turn, brought her a kind of joy she had not felt in years. Their laughter echoed in the cabin like a promise that even the harshest land could nurture love. 18 years passed, and the children had grown into strong, capable young adults. They had learned the ways of the land and the ways of the world beyond it, guided by the gentle, steadfast hand of the woman who had saved them. She often wondered about the lives they might have had if the world had been kinder, if the raids had never come, if their parents had survived. But those thoughts were fleeting, chased away by the reality of what she had now, a family born of circumstance, stitched together with courage and compassion. Yet even as life seemed steady, there was a sense of waiting, a shadow lingering at the edge of her peace. Something in the wind, the way the hawks circled overhead, whispered that change was coming. The evening the knock came was ordinary at first. The sun slipping behind the distant mountains, painting the sky with deep oranges and purples. She had been sitting on the porch, shelling beans and humming a tune her husband used to sing, when the sound reached her ears. One sharp, deliberate rap at the door. She paused, her hand frozen mid-motion, and her heart thumped in a way that made her chest ache. Visitors were rare, and strangers rarer still. When she opened the door, there stood a man whose presence seemed to carry the weight of the land itself. He was tall, his build lean and muscular, his eyes sharp and alert, dark as the night and filled with a history she could not yet know. He wore the markings of an Apache warrior, his clothes adorned with feathers and beads that told stories she could not read but somehow felt in her bones. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the silence stretching as though the world itself had paused to witness the moment. She did not know if she should speak, and he did not move, only his eyes searching hers as if looking for answers to questions she had never dared to ask. There was something in his gaze that stirred memories long buried, the cries of the children, the nights spent keeping them safe, the years of quiet, persistent care. And in that instant, she felt the fragile balance of her world shift. The man before her was a reminder of the past she had tried to leave behind, a past intertwined with the children she had raised and the unknown paths their lives might now take. He spoke finally, his voice low and steady, carrying the cadence of the land and the rhythm of a life shaped by survival. "I've come for them," he said, and though he did not raise his hand, she felt the weight of those words pressing against her like a storm on the horizon. Her mind raced, heart pounding, as she thought of the children she had raised as her own, the years of trust and love she had built, the world she had fought to create for them. Who was he to come claiming what she had nurtured, protected, and loved for nearly 2 decades? The wind whispered through the trees behind him, carrying a chill that seemed to seep into her bones. She could feel the distance between them as both physical and symbolic, a barrier shaped by years, by history, by lives that had intertwined in ways she could not yet comprehend. And she realized with a mixture of fear and anticipation that this moment would change everything. The quiet, steady life she had built was on the brink of unraveling, and nothing would ever be the same. As the sun disappeared behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the cabin and the land beyond, she stood there, the door open, the world holding its breath. The man waited, his eyes fixed on her, waiting for her to understand that this encounter was not a passing event, but a turning point. She could feel it in the air, thick and electric, a tension that spoke of history, of duty, of bonds that could never be broken. And deep inside, she knew that the story of her life, of the children she had saved, and of the land she had loved so fiercely, was about to take a turn that no one could have predicted. She took a step back, the fear and anticipation twisting together, and realized that whatever happened next, nothing would be simple. The door remained open, the evening shadows stretching long and uncertain across the porch, and the Apache warrior stood there, silent but unyielding, a living question waiting for an answer she could not yet give. The evening stretched on, the wind rustling the leaves in a restless whisper, carrying a sense of urgency that pressed against the cabin walls. Inside, the woman stood frozen, her hand lingering on the doorframe as if it were the only anchor to the world she knew. The Apache warrior did not move, but his eyes scanned the cabin, lingering on the simple furniture, the small hearth where embers glowed faintly, and the walls lined with tools and memories of a life built from hardship and care. In the silence, the history between them seemed to hang, invisible yet palpable, twisting through the air like smoke. She finally stepped aside, allowing him entrance, though suspicion coiled tight in her chest. The cabin felt smaller with him in it, though the space had not changed, as if the weight of his presence pressed against the walls. He removed his worn leather hat and placed it gently on the table, revealing long dark hair that fell past his shoulders, streaked faintly with gray at the temples. His eyes, though kind, held a hardness shaped by years of survival, by battles fought both in the open plains and within his own tribe. He spoke again, his voice steady, carrying the authority of a man accustomed to command, yet laced with a hint of something else, something she could not yet name. "My name is not important," he said, and she noted the slight tension in his jaw, the way his fingers fidgeted at his belt. "What matters is the children. I've come because they are mine to find, to guide, and to bring back." Her heart raced at the words. She understood his meaning, though part of her resisted acknowledging it aloud. The children she had raised were not just children, they were her family, the embodiment of years of care, love, and unspoken sacrifice. She had always known that one day the past might come calling. And now, standing before her, was a living reminder of a world she had tried to shield them from, a world that was both theirs and not theirs. Bound by blood and culture she could only glimpse from the outside. She studied him, trying to read the truth behind his words. "You expect me to just what? Hand them over?" she asked quietly, her voice steady, despite the tremor she felt inside. The firelight danced across the floor, casting flickering shadows on the walls, and she could feel every heartbeat in the room. He shook his head slowly. "I do not ask you to hand them over. Not yet. I come to understand first. To see who they have become, to see the life they've lived." There was a pause. a weight in his tone that made her realize he was speaking of more than the children themselves. He spoke of heritage, of duty, of a connection that reached back through generations. "And you," he added softly, "have raised them as your own. That does not go unnoticed." For a moment, neither spoke. Outside, the sky had deepened to indigo, and the first stars began to glimmer faintly, distant and unyielding. The wind carried the smell of smoke and dry earth, the scent of a land that was both beautiful and cruel. She wondered what the children were doing now, whether they sensed the tension that had settled like a heavy blanket over the cabin. Would they understand the arrival of a man they had never met, one who claimed a place in their past and perhaps their future? Her mind drifted back nearly 2 decades. The day she had found the infants in the ravine remained etched in her memory with startling clarity. They had been small, fragile, crying out with a hunger not just for food but for comfort, for human touch, for someone to tell them they were safe. She had wrapped them in her shawl and carried them home through the frost, speaking softly as if words alone could shield them from the memory of whatever had brought them to that place. That moment had defined her life, had set her on a path she had never expected to take, yet one she would never regret. Raising them had been its own journey of struggle and reward. The world was not kind to a woman alone, especially one raising children of another tribe. She remembered the early nights when she feared the cold would take them, when she had held them close, whispering lullabies that belonged to neither culture entirely. She had taught them to read the land, to hunt, to cook, to carry themselves with dignity and respect. She had given them a home and a life, and in return, they had given her hope and laughter in a world that often seemed empty. The warrior's presence now forced her to reckon with the fragility of that peace. She could feel it slipping like water through her fingers, the certainty of their life together suddenly tinged with unease. He had come not as an enemy, but as someone with a claim rooted in history, in bloodlines she could not erase. And yet she could not simply allow him to disrupt the family they had become. She had questions, many questions, but the words caught in her throat. How had he found them after all these years? Why now? What did he want beyond what he had already said? He moved closer to the hearth, studying the children's small belongings laid neatly on the shelves. His hands hovered over a carved wooden toy, a small bundle of feathers, and an old photograph of the 3 of them taken years ago, long before he had arrived. There was a reverence in his touch, a recognition of the care she had taken to preserve their world. "They are strong," he said finally, as if speaking to the fire itself. "They carry the spirit of their people, yet they carry you as well." Her chest tightened at the words. The children were strong, yes, but were they ready for what he represented? Could they understand a life that belonged to a world they had never truly known? One filled with stories, traditions, and responsibilities far older than she could teach. The thought of introducing them to a heritage that had been absent for 18 years filled her with equal parts dread and curiosity. What would they feel? What would they choose? She took a deep breath, the smell of smoke and wood filling her lungs, grounding her in the present, even as the past and future collided in the cabin. "You say you have a claim on them," she said carefully, "but they are not yours to take without knowing what they want, what they've become. They are more than a link to the past. They are living here, with me, in a world they know." The warrior nodded slowly. "I understand," he replied, and for the first time, a flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. "I do not come to take them blindly. I come to see, to learn, to honor what you have given. And if the time comes, to guide them into what they are meant to be." His words carried weight, yet they did not ease her anxiety. She could feel the tension coiling tighter, a mixture of hope, fear, and anticipation that made her restless. She glanced toward the back of the cabin, wondering what the children would say if they were here now. Would they embrace him, fear him? Would the bond they shared with her hold strong against the pull of blood and tradition? Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and carrying with it the distant cry of a coyote, sharp and mournful. The night seemed alive with 1,000 unseen eyes, 1,000 untold stories pressing against the edges of their little cabin. She realized that this encounter was far from over. It was only the first chapter of a confrontation with a past she had tried to bury, with a future that threatened to rewrite everything she had built. The warrior finally straightened, his gaze returning to hers, steady and unwavering. "They are waiting," he said quietly, as if speaking more to himself than to her. "And so am I." She felt the weight of those words settle over her like a storm cloud ready to break. Waiting, not just for him, but for the moment when the children would meet the man who carried a piece of their history. For the questions that would arise, for the choices that would need to be made. She knew then that the nights ahead would be long, filled with conversations and confrontations she could not yet imagine. And she understood, with a certainty that cut deep, that the peace she had cherished for 18 years was fragile, as delicate as the first frost on the prairie. The wind howled again, louder this time, rattling the cabin and stirring the embers in the hearth. Outside, shadows shifted, long and dark, stretching across the land that had been witness to countless stories, and two lives shaped by hardship, courage, and resilience. She felt the past and present pressing against each other, and somewhere deep inside, she sensed that the story she had lived would soon merge with the story the warrior brought. She did not yet know what would come of it, what choices the children would make, or how her own heart would be tested. But she knew one thing: nothing would ever be the same. And as she stood there, facing the man who had come to reclaim a part of their lives, she realized that the nights ahead would carry a tension that would not easily be broken, a suspense that would demand courage, truth, and perhaps even sacrifice. The next morning dawned gray and still, the kind of morning where the chill clung to every surface, and even the birds seemed hesitant to take flight. The widow moved about the cabin with practiced care, her hands busy with breakfast, while her mind raced in quiet loops of worry. She could not stop thinking about the warrior who had arrived the previous night, standing in her doorway as if he had a right to claim what she had fought so long to protect. His presence was like a stone thrown into a pond. The ripples reached every corner of her life, touching the children she had raised, the land she had tended, and even the memories of her husband. She heard the children stirring in the back room. They were no longer small, no longer fragile. One of them, taller than she remembered from years past, pushed open the door and blinked sleep from his eyes. The other, softer in demeanor, but just as alert, followed closely. Their faces held the mix of curiosity and caution that she had come to know so well. She could see in their eyes that they sensed the tension in the cabin, though they did not yet know its source. The man sat near the hearth, his posture calm but alert, as if he were listening to the walls themselves. When the children emerged, he rose, bowing slightly in respect, and the room seemed to shift with the unspoken acknowledgement of something ancient and profound. The older of the two children, a young man now, stepped forward first. "Who are you?" he asked, voice steady, though his hands clenched at his sides. The warrior's eyes softened, and he spoke in careful, measured words. "I am a friend, though I know the word may feel strange. I am a guide, someone who has waited a long time to meet you. I am part of your history, and perhaps part of your future, the younger one." A young woman tilted her head, her brows furrowing in uncertainty. "Our history?" she repeated, and the way her voice carried both curiosity and suspicion made the woman realize that the children were caught between two worlds: the life they had known with her, and the life that had been theirs before she found them. The widow felt a pang in her chest, the ache of knowing the inevitable was here. "He has come from your people," she said quietly, as if the words themselves could soften the impact. From the Apache, the silence that followed was heavy. The children exchanged glances, the young man's jaw tight, the young woman's fingers twisting in thought. Neither spoke, but the tension filled the cabin, thick and almost tangible. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows with a restless energy. It was as if the land itself understood that the calm of the past 18 years was about to be challenged. The warrior continued, describing the world beyond the plains they had always known, telling stories of tribes, traditions, and responsibilities that were part of their heritage. He spoke of ceremonies, of leadership, and of paths they might follow if they chose. Each word seemed to draw the children in, yet also set them on edge, reminding them of an identity that had been absent for too long. The widow watched carefully, noticing the subtle reactions, the young man's eyes narrowing as he processed the words, the young woman's lips pressing together as if holding back questions she did not yet dare to ask. She saw the fear, the curiosity, and the conflict flickering across their faces. They had been safe in her care, shielded from the weight of the world. and now that shield was being tested. Later that afternoon, the young man wandered to the edge of the cabin, staring out over the open plains. The horizon stretched endlessly, golden and dry under the sun, yet in his mind it felt small and confining. He thought of the warrior's words, of a world that had existed long before he was born, and yet was intrinsically his own. Could he belong to two worlds? Could he honor the life he had been given while embracing the one that had been his all along? The questions twisted in his mind, each one heavier than the last. Meanwhile, the young woman sat by the window, her fingers brushing over a worn piece of cloth the widow had kept from the early days. She remembered nights when the cabin had been cold and the world outside even colder, and how the woman had held them close and whispered stories of courage and survival. Could she leave the comfort and certainty of that love for a past she barely remembered? The thought unsettled her, yet a part of her felt drawn to the warrior's presence, a thread connecting her to a heritage that had always been hers, but remained unseen. The widow moved between them, trying to offer quiet reassurance. But she knew that her words could do little against the pull of history and identity. She could only stand as witness to the unfolding tension, her heart torn between protecting the children she had raised and acknowledging the call of their bloodline. Each step in the cabin seemed heavier now, each glance across the room loaded with unspoken fears and expectations. As the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long across the cabin floor, the warrior suggested a walk outside, saying the open land could help ease the conversation. The widow hesitated, but the children, torn by curiosity and the need for answers, agreed. They stepped into the crisp air, the prairie stretching endlessly before them, the wind brushing against their faces as if urging them forward. The warrior led them to a nearby ridge, where the land fell away to reveal the winding river below. He spoke of the Apache way of life, of balance and respect, of the duties that came with strength and knowledge. "It is not just a matter of blood," he said. "It is a matter of understanding who you are, where you come from, and what your spirit calls for. You carry the teachings of your people, even if you do not yet see them. You carry the love and care of the woman who raised you." The young man clenched his fists, trying to reconcile the life he had always known with the one being offered to him now. The young woman remained silent, her eyes tracing the river's path, wondering if it could carry her answers or only deepen the questions she could not yet ask. The widow stood behind them, her heart aching with both pride and fear. She had saved them, given them life, and now she had to let them navigate a world that might demand more than they were ready to give. Neighbors, curious and wary, had started to notice the unusual visitor and the strange dynamics in the widow's home. Some saw the warrior as a threat, others as a figure of intrigue. Rumors traveled fast on the prairie, and soon questions about the children's heritage and the woman's choices reached ears that might not have kind intentions. The widow realized that the conflict was no longer contained within the cabin. It had begun to spill outward, touching lives and stirring fears, prejudices, and curiosity alike. The children returned from their walk as dusk fell, the sky painted in deep reds and purples. They were quieter than before, their minds heavy with thoughts they could not yet speak aloud. The warrior remained patient, understanding that the seeds of knowledge and recognition required time to grow. He knew the conflict was not just about him or them, it was about identity, loyalty, and the tension between past and present. Inside, the widow prepared a simple supper. But the atmosphere was tense, the quiet interrupted only by the occasional crackle of the fire. The children spoke in fragments, testing their words carefully, each sentence a cautious step toward understanding. The warrior responded in kind, offering stories and guidance, but never pressing too hard. Aware that the real conflict could not be solved in a single evening or a single conversation, night deepened, and with it, the sense of suspense grew. Outside, the prairie seemed alive, the wind carrying faint, distant sounds, perhaps animals, perhaps something else, something unseen but felt. The land mirrored the tension in the cabin, vast and unpredictable, holding secrets that demanded respect and caution. Each person in the cabin felt the pull of forces larger than themselves, the weight of heritage, the power of choice, and the fragile bonds of family stretched across lines of blood and love. As the night wore on, the warrior shared a quiet story of a past raid, of families torn apart and children lost, and the lessons learned through survival and resilience. The young man's eyes glimmered with unspoken emotion. The young woman's lips trembled, and the widow's chest ached with the weight of it all. The story was a mirror of their own lives in many ways, and they could not ignore the parallels. The conflict was no longer theoretical, light was lived, immediate, and deeply personal. The night ended with a tension unresolved, questions unasked, and decisions still out of reach. The warrior slept lightly by the fire, listening to the wind and the creaks of the cabin. Ready to act when needed but patient, knowing that the conflict required careful navigation. The widow lay awake in her small room, thinking of the years past, the children she had saved, and the uncertainty of the days to come. The children themselves rested fitfully, minds filled with half-formed thoughts, the pull of the past mingling with the life they had known. Outside, the prairie remained endless, mysterious, and indifferent. The stars glittered cold and distant, witness to the unfolding story. The wind whispered secrets carried from one horizon to the next. The conflict had deepened, layered now with subplots of heritage, identity, loyalty, and love. The tension would not abate icily, and every choice made by the children, the widow and the warrior, would have consequences that stretched far beyond the cabin's walls. The night held its breath, and the story waited, poised on the edge of revelation and action, ready to test hearts, spirits, and the bonds that tied them together. The dawn came sharp and pale, cutting through the horizon with a light that made the cabin look almost fragile against the vastness of the prairie. Inside, the tension from the previous day had not lifted. The widow moved quietly, preparing breakfast with hands that trembled slightly, a subtle reflection of the storm brewing in her chest. The children, now fully grown, lingered near the doorway, restless and uneasy. Their eyes met hers briefly, searching for guidance, for reassurance that she could give no matter how much she wanted to. The Apache warrior was already awake, standing near the window, his gaze fixed on the endless land stretching before them, as if he could see answers hidden in the distance. The young man broke the silence first, his voice low and hesitant. "Why did you come here now?" asked the warrior, though part of him already knew the answer. The man's eyes met his, steady and unwavering. "Because the time has come," he said simply. "Because what you are meant to know cannot wait any longer." The words seemed simple, but their weight pressed down on the cabin, heavy and unyielding. The young woman crossed her arms, staring at the floor, unwilling to meet his gaze, yet feeling the pull of curiosity that made her heart pound. She thought of the life they had always known, safe and sheltered, and contrasted it with the stories the warrior had shared the day before, stories of a world that demanded courage, knowledge, and connection to something deeper than the land itself. Could she leave what she had always trusted for what was unfamiliar, yet undeniably hers? The widow cleared her throat, trying to anchor the moment. "You have a choice," she said quietly. "You can listen, learn, and decide for yourselves. But remember, no matter what path you take, the love that raised you is still here. Nothing can change that." The warrior nodded once, acknowledging the truth in her words. Yet even as he spoke, she could feel the tension thickening, coiling around them like a living thing. There was no easy path forward. The children were caught in a web of loyalty and identity between the woman who had saved them and nurtured them, and a heritage that had waited silently for years to reclaim them. By mid-morning, they had ventured outside again, walking toward the ridge where the land opened into endless sky and the river shimmered far below. The wind whipped around them, carrying the scent of dry grass, earth, and the faint temps of smoke from a distant campfire. The warrior spoke of leadership, of responsibility, of what it meant to be an Apache in a world that had often been cruel and unforgiving. Each word seemed to weigh on the children, building a tension that made their steps heavier, their breathing tighter. The young man finally stopped, turning to face the warrior fully. "And what if I don't want it?" he asked, voice firm though trembling slightly. "What if I want to stay here with her, with the life I know?" The warrior's gaze softened, though it did not lose its intensity. "Then you remain true to yourself," he replied. "But no, this, the world you know, is only part of who you are. There is a fire inside you that cannot be ignored forever." The young woman, standing beside her brother, felt a lump rise in her throat. She had always been more quiet, more reflective, but the questions pressed upon her like a weight she could not move. Could she deny the part of herself that had been shaped by a culture she barely remembered, yet instinctively felt? Could she honor the love of the woman who had saved her while answering a call that had never been silenced? They returned to the cabin as the sun rose higher, the shadows retreating but leaving behind a tension that had only grown sharper. Inside, the widow moved about with quiet efficiency, preparing a meal that none of them could eat with ease. Words hung unspoken in the air, glances were exchanged but fell short of connection, and the Apache warrior seemed almost like a part of the landscape, calm yet immovable, waiting for the right moment to speak, to act, to challenge them further. As afternoon approached, the land beyond the cabin seemed to mirror the rising conflict. The wind picked up again, tossing dry grass and dust into the air, making the horizon waver like a mirage. The young man wandered outside, drawn to the ridge again, as if seeking clarity in the endless expanse. The warrior followed silently, matching his steps without words. He spoke only when they reached the top, his voice carrying over the wind. "You must understand," he said, "that every choice has consequence. The two are not easily reconciled." The young man clenched his fists, jaw tight. "And what if they never can be reconciled?" He asked. "What if the path I am told to take destroys what I already love?" The warrior's expression remained unreadable, a mixture of patience and gravity. "Then you must decide what you are willing to sacrifice, and what you are willing to fight for." Back at the cabin, the young woman had stayed behind, sitting quietly by the window, listening to the faint sound of voices carried by the wind. She had always been sensitive to the rhythm of the land, to the small shifts in energy around her. And now she could feel the tension in every corner of the prairie, in the whisper of the trees, in the sway of the tall grass. She realized that the conflict was larger than herself, larger than any one person, and yet intimately tied to every choice she would make. By evening, the tension had grown unbearable. The widow, sensing that the moment of reckoning was near, gathered the children near the hearth. "You have heard him," she said quietly, gesturing to the warrior who stood silently. "You have felt the pull of your past and the love that has always been your present. The time to decide is not today, perhaps, but the choices you make will shape everything to come. And the world outside these walls is watching, waiting as well." The warrior stepped forward, his presence commanding yet gentle. "There is a gathering," he said, "a place where your people meet, where decisions are made and paths are chosen. You will not go unprepared. You will not go alone. But you must understand that what awaits is not a test of strength alone, but of heart, of loyalty, of who you truly are." The children exchanged a glance, their hearts racing with fear and excitement. The young man's eyes were dark with thought, the young woman's lips pressed tight in contemplation. The widow's chest ached as she saw the conflict play out on their faces, the pull of home versus heritage, of love versus duty, of safety versus destiny. She knew that whatever happened next could change everything, that the lives they had known were poised on a knife's edge, ready to be swept away by forces beyond her control. Night fell again, the prairie cloaked in deep blue shadows, the wind carrying a restless energy that seemed to shake even the sturdy cabin. The children sat silently by the fire, the warrior standing near the doorway, his eyes scanning the horizon as if the land itself held the answers they sought. The widow moved quietly among them, offering small comforts, but knowing that soon she would have to let them face the truth for themselves. Outside, distant lights flickered along the ridge. Perhaps travelers, perhaps omens, perhaps signs of the gathering the warrior had spoken of. Every sound, every movement seemed magnified in the quiet night, carrying with it a sense of anticipation, of danger, and of the unknown. The tension in the cabin mirrored the tension in the land itself, pulse that would not be ignored, a drumbeat that carried toward a moment of confrontation that none of them could yet see fully. The warrior finally spoke again, his voice steady over the crackle of the fire. "Tomorrow, you will meet others," he said. "Others who will challenge you, who will expect you to answer for the choices you make. The path ahead is not easy. It is fraught with trials. And yet it is the only path that will show you who you truly are." The young man's hands tightened in his lap. The young woman's eyes glimmered with unshed tears, and the widow's throat ached with the weight of what was to come. The fire flickered, shadows dancing across the walls, as if echoing the internal struggle within each of them. The night deepened, carrying the tension to a peak, leaving every heartbeat amplified, every thought urgent, every moment pregnant with the possibility of transformation or loss. The prairie outside seemed to hold its breath, stars sharp against the dark sky, distant witnesses to the gathering storm. The wind whispered secrets in languages no one spoke aloud, carrying hints of destiny, duty, and the inescapable pull of heritage. The cabin, though small and simple, had become the stage for a story that spanned generations, a story that demanded courage, wisdom, and a willingness to face the unknown. The night grew colder, the fire dwindled, and the tension became almost unbearable. Each person in the cabin knew, without saying, that the coming days would test them in ways they could not yet imagine. The warrior's presence, the children's choices, and the widow's love were all threads in a tapestry that was rapidly unraveling, building toward a climax that would demand truth, confrontation, and perhaps sacrifice. And in that stillness, with the wind carrying whispers across the prairie, the story held on the edge of revelation, poised to erupt into the most intense, decisive moments of all. The morning sun spilled gold across the prairie, painting the cabin in warm light. And for the first time in many days, there was a stillness that felt both fragile and profound. The children, now fully grown, moved about with cautious determination, their eyes reflecting the weight of choices they had been forced to face. The Apache warrior stood near the door, watching them with a mixture of pride and patience, understanding that the true challenge had always been not in action, but in heart. The widow stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on the young man's shoulder. "Whatever path you choose," she said softly, "know that this home, these walls, and my heart remain yours. You will never walk alone, even if you walk into a world that is new and unknown." Her words carried the quiet authority of someone who had lived through hardship, loss, and love, and who now offered the children not orders, but freedom. The young man inhaled sharply, the weight of his fatherless past and the pull of his heritage pressing against him. I want to know," he admitted, his voice shaking, but determined. "I want to understand who I am, where I come from, but I also want to honor what she's given me. I don't want to lose this. I want to know my people, my history, but I cannot leave behind what has shaped me." The warrior's face softened, the lines of intensity giving way to relief. "Then we walk together," he said. "I will teach you what I can, guide you through what must be learned, and respect the life you have known. There is strength in knowing both, and courage in honoring both." The tension that had shadowed the cabin for weeks began to ease, replaced by a quiet sense of purpose. The children felt the stirring of identity not as a threat, but as a bridge connecting the past that had been denied to them and the present that had nurtured them. Days passed as they prepared for the journey to meet the wider Apache community. The widow taught them practical skills one last time, tending the small garden, checking their supplies, and reminding them of lessons that extended beyond survival: compassion, patience, and resilience. Each story deepened the children's understanding, weaving together the threads of their dual identities. The morning they left the cabin, the prairie stretched wide and open, a world full of possibility and promise. The widow stood at the door, her eyes glistening with unshed tears, yet her heart was full. "Go with courage," she said quietly, "and know that wherever you go, this home is yours." The young man and young woman paused, glancing back at the cabin and the woman who had given them life beyond birth. Their hearts swelled with gratitude and love. The warrior stood beside them, a quiet anchor of strength and guidance. Together, the three of them began their journey across the prairie, the wind lifting around them like a promise of what was to come. The journey was not easy. The land was vast and demanding, the sun beating down on long stretches of open plain, and the nights cold and lonely. But each step reinforced the connection to heritage and home, a balance of past and present that slowly shaped their spirits. The warrior introduced them to the rhythms of the land in ways the widow could not, teaching them to read tracks, to sense the weather, to respect the unseen forces that guided life. Each lesson was a revelation, a deeper understanding of the world their ancestors had known and honored. Yet even in these moments, they never forgot the woman who had raised them. Her lessons and love were an unspoken guide, her values sewn into every action they took. The young man, once hesitant and conflicted, found a quiet confidence in knowing he could honor both paths. The young woman discovered a courage that had been shaped by both love and lineage, a strength that carried her forward with steady resolve. When they finally reached the gathering of the Apache, the air was charged with expectation. Elders and warriors alike observed the newcomers, the children who had been raised outside the tribe yet bore the marks of their people in spirit and heart. The warriors spoke for them, recounting their journey, their upbringing, and the choices that had led them to this point. The elders listened, nodding with understanding and respect, recognizing the children not as strangers, but as bearers of legacy who had been nurtured with care and love. The children stepped forward together, feeling the weight of history and the power of connection. They were no longer just the infants found in a ravine. The elders offered guidance, welcomed them, and shared the ceremonies that had been part of their lineage for generations. Every moment reinforced their dual identity, honoring both the life they had lived with the widow and the history that had always been theirs. Back at the cabin, the widow tended her garden with a sense of quiet fulfillment. The house was emptier now, the echo of their laughter lingering like a gentle reminder of all that had passed, yet she felt no regret. She had saved them once, raised them with courage and love, and now she had entrusted them to a future where they could embrace all that they were meant to be. The Apache warrior returned briefly, offering a respectful farewell, a bond of gratitude and shared purpose. As weeks turned into months, the children adapted to their new life among their people while maintaining a connection to the widow who had raised them. They carried her love with them always, foundation that gave them courage to navigate challenges and honor traditions without fear. The widow, in turn, found peace in her quiet cabin, and she realized that love had the power to transform lives in ways even the harshest land could not diminish. She understood now that family was not only bound by blood but by the acts of care, sacrifice, and courage that defined a life lived with heart. She sat on the porch, gazing across the land that had been witness to so much. The wind carried the familiar scent of sagebrush, of earth, and of distant fire, and she smiled quietly. Life had tested her, shaped her, and ultimately revealed the depth of what it meant to save, nurture, and release. She had done more than raise children; she had prepared them to find themselves, to honor their heritage, and to carry forward both the lessons of the past and the love of their present. The Apache warrior had returned to his people, but his presence remained a quiet force in her life, a reminder that connections, even unexpected ones, could endure across distance and time. The children, now young adults, had embraced the richness of their dual identity, carrying both the teachings of the woman who had raised them and the legacy of their people with pride and wisdom. And as night fell over the prairie, the stars shimmering like countless witnesses above, the widow felt a sense of completeness. She had faced uncertainty, danger, and the weight of history, and yet love had guided her every step. In the end, she knew that life was not measured by the absence of challenge, but by the courage to face it, the willingness to nurture, and the wisdom to let go when the time came. The wind whispered softly through the grass, carrying a story of resilience, of family, and of the quiet heroism found in ordinary hearts. The cabin stood firm, a symbol of life, love, and the extraordinary journey that had begun with 2 abandoned infants and a widow's unwavering courage. And in the stillness of the prairie night, there was peace, a gentle affirmation that even in the harshest of lands, compassion and bravery could shape the world and leave a legacy that would endure for generations to come.